Our last speaker this afternoon is Ilja Seržant, and he's going to talk about the evolution of bound person indexes, the dynamic typology approach.
Okay, so evolution of bound person indexes. So this is a I will also be relying myself on a notion introduced by Martin Haspelmatt, but to make it short, I will look on those kind of things like in this German paradigm, like GE, so first singular E, and etc. So that's the things I'm interested in. So bound person indexes undergo very versatile changes. So they may emerge, they may be reduced in the course of time, they may be also enlarged, and in some languages they just remain the same without any changes across quite a long period of time. Now, once they emerge, there are different sources from where they may come from. So the most prominent, perhaps, is the independent pronouns, and that has been discussed, for example, by Givon. But that's not the only source, and in fact, actually, it's not. Well, maybe it's the most frequent one, but the second one is actually also quite frequent. So the person indexes may also stem from auxiliaries that themselves inflect for person and number. So imagine, like in English, if we would the inflection of the verb to be would yield an epiperiphrasis, will merge with the lexical verb, and we'll have again the full-fledged person number agreement, but this one will not stem from any independent pronouns or something, just from the auxiliaries. So, for example, in the Polish past tense, we have a form like robiłem, which means I worked, it's the past tense, but crucially that historically stems from the fusion of a former clitic auxiliary plus the past participle. They may also, and that is of course more marginal, they may also stem from nominalized forms such as different kinds of participles, the verbal nouns, etc., and they are most frequently found in the third person, but not only. So, for example, the third singular in Proto-Finnic, as reconstructed as P in Proto-Finnic, stems from a former participle suffix, actually. So that was a kind of derivational suffix, but then later, due to some sequences of changes, it became just the dedicated third-person singular, like in these languages. Well, trivially, of course, once these person number indexes are there, they of course may be reduced in the course of time. So, for example, by sound law, for example, all closed syllables were opened in Proto-Slavic. Now, so basically all coda consonants were dropped. Now, crucially, this happened not only in particular in the inflectional syllables, but across the whole word. So also in the middle of the word, in the beginning, etc. So there were no restrictions. So this is a kind of one may call blind process, phonetically based process, what young grammarians called sound law. But there is also different kind of reduction, maybe also different kind of reduction, like irregular change, right? Very often found, for example, in different kinds of grammaticalization process, and that's a very different thing actually from the first one. So, for example, well, that's not a grammaticalization, but just another example. So, the third singular t is lost, well, corresponding to Russian t, right? Was lost in Polish and actually in many Russian dialects. Although actually there was no sound change responsible for this, so you can see that in exactly the same context, like the now, which means net, the same sound was not dropped. It's only in the third person, so there must be something. There must be at least functional constraint, or there must be something that's very specific to that particular morphological slot. Now, less trivial that the person number indexes may also be enlarged in the course of time. So, for example, the Polish first plural my goes back to the form with the long vowel, even though historically we know that the Proto-Slavic was certainly with a short vowel. So for some reason this vowel was lengthened to some analogy. So Comrie, for example, says it was in analogy to the independent pronoun, but we don't know exactly. It's not important. Crucially, the indexes may also grow in the course of time. Another thing which may let them grow is when the segments that originally belong to the stem, like in this Lithuanian example, third person, may be just reinterpreted as dedicated person number indexes. In this case, it is the third person, and you can see actually that it was originally, the R was originally just a stem, derivational stem vowel, and the same happens, for example, in Italian. Basically, you have to analyze it like this. We may also find retention, so sometimes the bound indexes simply don't change across time. So it's weird, but still, Proto-Indo-European was approximately 80, and yet in Russian, some Russian dialects continue basically this form without any change, and across basically 5,000-6,000 years. So, well. So to sum up, the length of the bound person indexes is the result of various very heterogeneous historical processes. So they may emerge, they may be reduced, there might be kind of paradigmatic leveling, analogical extensions, and so forth. Now the question, is there something actually, are there higher order pressures that constrain this process? There are lots of processes going on historically, but is there something that actually that kind of brings a little bit of order in these things? And that is what I'm going to look at, basically. So the structure of this talk, I will present my database, and then the discussion part, which will consist of the synchronic and diachronic evidence, and then the conclusion. So my database consists of 240 modern languages, but actually it's genealogically actually very much biased, and that's the crucial point. So these are only 9 independent stocks. So I take Indo-European, Dravidian, and for some families I take basically the subfamilies for different kinds of reasons. You may ask me later why. So I'm crucially interested in basically how the modern languages basically develop what was originally inherited from the respective proto-language. That's why I take it depends on the family, but approximately I have from 10 to 50 languages per stock. And that yields 240, and so that basically all of the subfamilies are more or less evenly represented in the database. And in addition, I take the reconstructed protoforms, which were manually reconstructed by the historical comparative method in the authoritative literature. And crucially, what I call principle of continuity. So largely, I have to compare mutatis mutandis, one and the same paradigm across the languages and the same paradigm as in the proto-language, right? So, for example, I should not compare, for example, the, say, past tense of Russian, because it doesn't basically continue any of the older paradigms. So I should take something that is kind of a continuation of, and of course, across the same family must be largely the same paradigm. And intransitive, so for ergative languages, intransitive subjects only. Now, so I calculated the length of bound indexes for each language. Just to give you an example, this is a little bit, well, phoneticians might say that's actually not the right way to do. So, for example, if the segment was long, then I coded it with 1.5 for, I have my special reasons. For one segment is just 1, and if there are 3 segments, then it's 3. So basically, very simple. Okay, now what does it give us? So synchronic evidence. So basically, what I did is that then I calculated the average across all languages of that particular family. So for example, in Indo-European, the first singular, and these are modern languages, in Indo-European, the first singular is approximately 1.33 segments long. And then I did it for all other slots, and I calculated the mean length. So when they look approximately like that, and I guess we can make some generalizations on the basis of this. Here, just to show you the median, because just to show you that in fact these averages actually are representative, and there is not that the range of the length is not that high, and they indeed concentrate. Most of the languages indeed concentrate around these values. So the median. just shows you that the averages are actually an adequate proxy for what we actually see. But I will just continue with the means. Now, let's compare within the singular set the first, second, as opposed to the third person. Well, excuse me, the singular set as opposed to the plural set. Of course, that's maybe trivial, but no one has shown this, that the singular indexes are never shorter than their respective plural counterparts. And that kind of seems to be a quite robust tendency. Actually, it's very difficult to find exceptions to this. A less robust generalization that we can make is that the third person singular seems to be shorter than other persons. That's kind of also hold for the plural, but not actually that strongly. At least for the singular, it's very clear. So it's almost twice as short as the, well, a little bit less than. Now, another generalization, then I will be focusing basically here on this generalization. There are lots of things to say about the others, but I don't have time for. So I think we can even speak of sort of, well, you can call it attractor state, or you can call it standard length or ideal length of bound person indexes. So basically, I think one can generalize and say that the first and second tends to be, in the course of time, it tends to stabilize across around 1.7 segments, third person one around 1 segment, and there is some variation in the plural. And in fact, if I taking the stocks that I have, so if we, of course, that should not be taken as exactly. So with some range of variation. So basically, I calculated what is the good range of variation. So plus minus 0.3 segments, it doesn't yield actually good results. But if we operate with kind of this length plus minus 1.5, then actually we get quite good results, and 1 plus minus 1 is already even better. Okay, so that's what. So, I mean, you may say it's a bit trivial, but on the other hand, there are languages which have 5 or 6 segments in the endings, and then I basically can make some predictions about these languages. Okay, but first let's look into the diachronic evidence. So why diachrony? Actually, in modern typology, we want to see not just the synchronic distribution of particular properties, but we also, even more important, is to see whether the dynamics in the development really shows us a development towards more adhering to a particular generalization or basically deviating from it. So because the synchronic distribution may show certain biases, but these biases may have very different explanations in addition to the universalist explanation. So that's why the dynamic evidence is kind of better, is a better evidence. So one of the things, for example, that may basically skew or confound the synchronic distributions, what I call here source confound. So sometimes correlations may stem from similar sources or undergo similar grammaticalization paths, and so we get particular skewing in our database, but in fact this skewing is not the same as a universalist skewing, where there are really universal pressures going on. They are kind of more accidental, and we should exclude them basically. So that's why the diachronic evidence. So if we take this generalization, then basically what kind of predictions can we make? So if the proto language deviates from these preferences, from basically this standard, from this ideal length, then if the protoform was too long, then it has to be shortened, so it's actually very trivial. If the protoform was too short, then it has to be enlarged. And if it's perfectly fitting, then nothing should change, basically. Okay. So let's see how it works. So in this table, the first number is basically the length of the reconstructed protoforms, which I take independently from the literature. And the second number shows the average deviation taking all the modern languages of that family. So basically Mayan had originally 2.5 segments in Proto-Maya, and then if we take the modern languages, then they are the first singular is with 0.5 segments shorter than the protoform. And as you see, sometimes there is the forms are kind of grow across time. Okay. So let's see fixing by shortenings of the first prediction, basically. So, so for example, we take Indo-European, the plural. The Indo-European plural started with 4 segments, which is obviously far too long than actually the ideal length, so to say. And yet we observe that indeed we observe the shortening, which basically goes towards that generalization. Let's take another example. Mayan, first, second person are again somewhat too long, and yet modern languages indeed, on average, they shorten these protoforms so that they fit more into the length, into the values predicted by the length generalization. So I have to be a bit faster. So Sogeram, a small subfamily of Trans-New Guinea, Papua Trans-New Guinea, see first plural, for example, again started out with far too long endings, and they have been shortened. Just another example. And now, what is interesting, basically, you can see that first and second were shortened, but then nothing happened to the third person because it's exactly basically adhered to the generalization. So, so it's kind of makes quite good predictions. But of course, there are some exceptions, like this one. So the development basically should be, well, at least these values should stay approximately of the same length, but yet oceanic shortens them down. But if you look on the oceanic median values, then you see actually that they are higher. The reason for this average, in a sense, is not actually adequately describing the picture, because there are some oceanic languages that simply abandoned any inflection in the plural, and they are basically pressing the whole average down, basically. So in that sense, distorting the picture. Okay, so fixing by shortening, yeah, a good example. Proto-Finnic develops this third singular from the participle suffix p, and this is far too long as for this prediction, and yet in all Finnic languages this ending has been shortened, but crucially neither the first singular nor the second singular has undergone any shortening in this time. So the shortening happened only in the third person, and even so for example in Estonian it's but one segment, but Finnish, the only remnant of this in Finnish is that the stem vowel of the verb has to be lengthened. And this, well, I just idealized, so I kind of so Finnish I come with kind of 0.5 segments. It's basically super segmental, but just to account for the fact that something still happens there, but it's not really a full segment. Okay. And now you see fixing by enlarging. So, for example, Sogeram was a little bit too short, and yet it undergoes, on average, it undergoes enlarging. The same, for example, for Uralic. Okay, so maybe I should, since I don't have much time, and yes, and that's just to show you that some actually remain unchanged, so as predicted. Moreover, this length generalization may also be exploited to make even more predictions. So, for example, if an index considerably exceeds the standard, then it must be very recent. So, if there is an exception, like basically what this tells us is in the course of time, the system kind of fixes and brings the endings towards the length generalization. But of course, if a new ending just grammaticalizes, then of course it will not adhere because it has a different source, has a different history behind it. So if an ending is far too long, then the prediction is it must be very recent. It can't be an old ending. So, for example, in many Turkic languages, the plural was restructured in the sense that basically towards the agglutinative pattern, taking the second, in this case, second singular and adding a plural basically a plural ending onto it, and so yet we get a second plural which has 6 segments. And if you look into the literature on the history of Turkic languages, and you will find that this is really a very new ending, and it actually doesn't actually continue anything. And just another example of the same thing, but for example, for the third plural. Okay, so conclusions. Bound person indexes undergo different kinds of developments. They emerge in different ways, may be shortened in different ways, may be enlarged in different ways. They may also stay unchanged. And despite these very different kinds of processes, which are fully independent of each other, still we may observe that there is some kind of more higher order pressure that tries to channel this development in a particular way, such as to adhere to the number generalization, to the person generalization, and to the length generalization. Now, there is much more to say, actually, so these are not basically the ultimate cause for what happens. There is much more to say on why actually do we get this generalization, but I don't have obviously time. It's just for you that that's actually not a place where we would make a full stop. So if an index considerably exceeds standard length, it must be a recent development. And conversely, I have hypothesized, but I have to still to check it, that indexes which are considerably below the standards are either on the way to lose their functional load. So basically, for example, if in French or in English we get zeros, but that's because these indexes have a very different function from, say, indexes in, for example, Polish, which is kind of prodrop, etc. So, and in other case, of course, there might be some accidental shortening due to sound law, etc. So, there might be some accidents. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ilja. That's very interesting, and the talk is open for discussion of first Asya and then Boris.
I'm curious if you've thought about the reasons behind the person and number generalizations.
Yes. I just mentioned that there are lots. I can give another talk. So one. Yeah. So very roughly speaking, for asymmetries within, for example, singular set, these are certainly driven by frequencies. So you can. So the third person is much more frequent. But it's important, the third person bound index, not the third person independent pronoun, that has a different frequency restrictions. But the bound third person index is much more frequent than the other two, and that drives the development, basically. So, to be very short. And for the other, I guess it's also kind of frequency, and frequency itself is not kind of the ultimate cause. There is also something that constrains frequency. So that's why it's a very long talk. But the next cause, so to say, in this causal chain is frequency, and then there is something that constrains the frequency. Yes.
I wanted to ask a practical thing about these indexes. So if there is a long vowel, then it is 1.5.
Yes.
And the nasalized vowel?
Yes, I also did. Yes, I also. That's actually phonetically not correct, but it's just since I have this kind of diachronic perspective, and a long vowel usually develops from a diphthong. I just wanted to account for the fact that there is some reduction in production effort. Right, so if you produce a diphthong, of course, you need a little bit more production effort than if you produce a long vowel. The same is with nasalized vowel. And to account for this, I made this convention of having 1.5 segments. Yes, but that's just a convention.
And sometimes there are short vowels and long vowels, and then there are vowels that don't have short counterparts, but they are as long as long vowels. So how do you treat them?
Well, of course, I rely basically on the transcriptions that's given in the grammar. So if the grammar writes a short vowel, of course, I do not look on whether how exactly it is phonetically pronounced. Is it a long or short? So only if it is transcribed as long vowel, then it's. So it depends on the transcription.
So first Andrei and then Alec.
Okay, so the main motivation of the change that you mentioned is fixing the deviations from the, so I could call it gold standard of the language, yeah?
Well, it's not. No. It's
yeah,
not.
but
No,
so,
it's not the main it's not motivation at all in a sense. It's just a kind of constraint that all these different processes have to, in a kind of take into account or to obey to different extents.
But in this context, I would assume from your talk that if you take a family,
Yes.
all the family should have changes in the given cell of the paradigm should have a change only into one direction. For example, if third person singular was too long, we have to shorten it. So then, presumably, in your data, for any given family, for the whole list of the languages you have dealt with, you should have only one direction. Is that true or not? If not, why?
No. I mean that's like with any typological generalization, there are certainly exceptions, and that's why. So there are languages. So it's not to say that now all the languages of a particular family will all develop into one direction. But what is crucial is kind of the statistical significance. So kind of the predominant number of that languages will develop. But there are historical accidents, and that is, for example, if like in Finnic, if you grammaticalize a new third person, then it's subject to very different constraints because those constraints stem from the source. Now, once it is in the slot, then it is subject to the constraints that actually are for that particular slots, and then it will be fixed. But of course, it doesn't predict that you won't have any new develop or new grammaticalizations or whatever. Or no. So the picture is more complex.
Yeah, but if there are no historically explained deviations, all the variation is always the same. Yeah?
But the problem is there are historical deviations.
Yeah, actually, my question was similar to Andrei's question, but I just had my very different perspective that you predict that languages tend to stabilize in a certain state, but then we see that actually we do get two short markers and long markers. And it seems that one of the reasons is phonological change. If we have phonological change, then it will operate on any segment in any position. But then sometimes we know that these suffixes have irregular changes, like some changes are blocked, or some additional changes occur which don't occur in instance. Is this related to, can you predict that, for example, we expect affixes which are longer than normal to get some additional shortenings, for example, reductions which are not found in roots?
Yes, I predict that in the typological sense of prediction. That means I do not predict it for every particular language with no exception. I predict that if you take the sample of developments, then the majority of that sample will really do this. But not that, that there might be some language which has some sort of exception because we don't understand the whole, causality behind it. And another thing is that, of course, since I mentioned that what actually is behind these kind of generalizations is frequency. Now, frequency itself is determined by is constrained by the function. Now, of course, if you're moving basically from a kind of pro-drop system into a more English-style system, then the function changes, and then accordingly you will get different frequencies, and accordingly these predictions will not hold anymore. And that's what I mentioned a little bit. So, if as soon as you get a strong deviations from this are actually due to the fact that you might have a very different function, basically. So, for example, syntactic function.
I'm sorry I interrupt you here, and I think you're not correct at this point because it's if you change from a Italian style system to a French style system.
Yes.
The frequency of the verbal forms do not change.
No.
The frequency of the pronouns change. So,
no, exactly. But that's
so it's.
But that's.
I think your.
But that's the point.
Your conclusion is probably correct, but your logic seems to be strange.
No, but that's exactly so. Basically, what happens is if you move from a more Italian style system to French style system, that basically the functional load of the reference is carried over from the ending into the independent pronoun. Now, once basically you have completed this carrying over function, then you don't need the ending anymore. You may just drop it. Basically, that's kind of why you get these zeros in French, as opposed to, for example, I predict that Polish, for example, as long as it has this prodrop, it will kind of still be around this length generalization. So that's the idea.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. It was interesting, as it was already mentioned. I have a question about the rate of the process. I mean, if it is a kind of more or less a general tendency towards shortening the bound indexes, for example, or enlarging them, have you found some evidence about the rate of these processes? I mean, if it is a general tendency, so can we predict can we predict the rate?
Yes, actually that's an interesting, and actually I also asked myself this thing. So basically one way of doing it is to correlate basically but that's a little bit speculative. What we know basically of the time death of the proto-languages, we can correlate with what kind of developments we observe. So in other words, if there is shortening let's assume we know approximately the age of Proto-Indo-European, we can try to correlate the amount of, the way it shortens basically with, say, another family that is younger, for example. But I'm still actually, I don't know exactly, I'm thinking in that direction, yes, but I haven't done this yet. But I guess it's possible on the basis of this database. But on the other hand, another thing actually, the problem is that, another problem is that 9 stocks is a little bit too less if you have only 2 options. Maybe 9 stocks is something, maybe a little bit too less for that kind of thing.
The last question, please. Right, thank you for this very interesting talk. I have a question on your thoughts concerning the difference between the third person singular and the third person plural. Because if I remember correctly, the measurements for third person singular clearly shows that it was supposed to be the shortest one, while the third person plural was not really the shortest one. So, any thoughts on how come that there is this difference between third persons for different numbers? And this is one, and an even smaller one comes in the form of an exotic family of languages called Germanic. So, if you were to think about Germanic on one hand and English as one of its members, how would a particular language like English sort of face off with the general Germanic type?
Yes, no, but that's what I mentioned before. So I cannot make we are not in another sense we don't have that much knowledge basically about what happens in the languages so as to be able to predict every particular language. So English is an exception, and I don't know why. But I mean, if you speak about the third person being S and all other persons being, so exactly the reversed basically proportion of coding length. Now, the third person, since I think that the motivation behind these generalizations is frequency, it might be actually that the third person plural is a little bit different than the third person singular, because the third person singular might be a little bit more frequent because the third person plural is, let's put might be referentially more specific than the third person singular, because the third person singular might be just a default in many constructions, whereas the third person plural still will always have a referent, so to say, behind it, whereas the third person singular may sometimes probably be used where there is no referent whatsoever. But that's just a speculation. I have to think about it. And in fact, no, third person plural is actually not longer, so it doesn't contradict. But it doesn't. But the distribution in the plural set is not as clear as in the singular.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.